Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the key ideas that readers of Martin Heidegger's famous lecture, What is Metaphysics, often find most difficult to grasp and to wrap their heads around, so to speak, is this action or property, or however we want to conceive of it. Actually, none of these are adequate. That has to do with the nothing that Heidegger, in translation, is calling nihilation. In his German, he actually talks about das Nichts, nichtet, so the nothing, literally nothings. He's turning nothing from a noun of sorts into a verb, an action word. And so the question is, well, what is this? And it turns out to be a little bit less mystical or obscure or complicated when we look at the text closely than a lot of people make it out to be. And it has to do with the relationship between Dasein and being as a whole or a totality that is grasped through the mood of anxiety. We saw that the mood of anxiety reveals to us the nothing. So Heidegger is going to tell us that in anxiety, something happens with beings. They reveal themselves to us in a certain way, and that it's not annihilation and it's not negation as such. These are going to turn out to be dependent upon the nothing and what he's calling the nihilitive behavior of the nothing, or another way that he talks about it is a wholly repelling gesture. So we need to get at that, and this is in this section, the response to the question. He tells us that in anxiety there's this shrinking before, and it's a kind of bewildered calm. It affects both the Dasein, or the human being, the core, what it is that the human being is in their existence, and the totality of beings that they are immersed within. Remember that Dasein is one being among other beings, although it's a very special kind of being. And what we saw is that beings as a whole in anxiety are revealed to us or reveal themselves to us as in retreat, as moving away from us. Heidegger uses these spatial metaphors. And then he talks about the nothing itself. He says the nothing does not attract. It is essentially repelling. But this is a different kind of repulsion than we might think of in terms of like repugnance or negative, response to electromagnetic stimuli or something like that. Instead, he's using metaphors here too. We have to use spatial metaphors. It is repelling. He says this repulsion is itself as such a parting gesture. So think of waving goodbye, or it might also be a parting gesture like "screw you," or any other sort of thing. But it is pushing beings away, and these beings are, as he says, submerging as a whole. They're losing their meaning, you might say, and he calls this a wholly repelling gesture towards beings that are in retreat as a whole. And he says this is the action of the nothing that oppresses Dasein in anxiety. So one of the things that the action of the nothing is oppressing Dasein, oppressing the person in how they feel. So the nothing is intrinsically involved in the very feeling, mood, attunement, however we want to translate it, of anxiety that turns out to be one of the most important moods for Heidegger, for revealing reality to us. So that's one side of it. The other side is the beings. He goes on and he says, this is the essence of the nothing, nihilation. This is what the nothing does. You could say that the nothing is not merely a negativity, a privation, a lack. And it's not something either. This is why it gets quite difficult to wrap our heads around. But it also does something. Notice we can't avoid this something language, can we? And that is nihilation. So he goes on and he says, this is not an annihilation of beings. It doesn't completely destroy them or reduce them to nothing, because then the nothing wouldn't be doing anything in relation to something, right? So it's not annihilation. And he says, nor does it spring from a negation. The nothing, as we've seen, is prior to negation. And nihilation, the action of the nothing, is thereby also prior to the logical, intellectual operation of negation. So he goes on and he says, the nothing itself nihilates. And this is the phrase that drew a lot of criticism from people who, not just ordinary people who are like, what are you talking about? But also from other philosophers who said, look, you're treating the nothing itself as if it's something, or you are doing an illegal operation with language. There's sort of a lot of legislation of what language and logic can do. And Heidegger could actually say, yes, you're right. From the perspective of the logic that you're using, this does not make sense. This is a sort of nonsensical, jargony type of phrase that I'm coining. But if we're talking about the reality itself, it actually does have meaning. And it's a meaning that we can grasp experientially, existentially through anxiety. So he goes on and he says, nihilation is not some fortuitous accident. It's not something that just happens or that we could strip away and get rid of at some point. Rather, he says, as the repelling gesture towards the retreating whole of beings, here's where we get to something really important. What is this nihilation doing? We saw already that it oppresses Dasein. Does it do anything else? He says, yes. It discloses those beings in their full but heretofore concealed strangeness as what is radically other with respect to the nothing. So you might say that, to use another very important phrase that Heidegger coins, the nothing is what allows beings to be fully what they are. It provides them with a kind, you might say, a kind of contrast. It allows their features to come out in the fullness of what they are, not for the nothing, but for Dasein, for us, for our experience of them. Because the nothing is engaging in its action of nihilation towards these beings that are retreating as a whole, that we grasp through anxiety, we're able to understand, we're able to sense, we're able to find ourselves thrown into the totality of beings as a whole with the actual strangeness that they do present to us. A sort of radical otherness to nothing, but also to ourselves. So he goes on and he says, it's in the clear night of the nothing of anxiety, the original openness of beings as such arises, that they are beings and not nothing. See, before that, we were taking the beings for granted. And he had all that sort of wordplay at the beginning of, well, there's beings and nothing else. The nothing has some sort of whatever it is. It's not being, because it's not a being, but it's there with the beings, and it's what allows the beings to be what they are. So he goes on and he says, this and not nothing we add in our talk is not some kind of appended clarification. It makes possible in advance the revelation of beings in general. So the activity of the intellect in thinking about the totality of beings turns out secretly to be dependent upon the nothing, as you might say something like a condition for the possibility of what we call in philosophy a transcendental condition. It's also what is going on in anxiety which also grasps beings as a totality, but does so in an affective way rather than in a strictly cognitive way. So he goes on and he says, the essence of the originally annihilating nothing lies in this. This is the essence of the nothing, according to Heidegger. That it brings Dasein for the first time before beings as such. This does not mean, of course, that before there is this experience of the nothing and of its action of nihilation, that Dasein is not related to beings. Of course it is related to beings. It's in the midst of beings. But in order for us to grasp beings, not just as this book, that blackboard, or even certain universals that we might make of them, words that we might use to apply to them. In order to grasp them metaphysically, Heidegger would say, we have to take into account the nothing. And fortunately for us, when we are in original anxiety, we do indeed take account of it, even though we may not fully understand it in a cognitive way. We grasp beings as such by the wholly repelling gesture, the nihilation of the nothing.